My fiancée slept with my best friend after I funded her life, so I walked away quietly and ruined their plans without saying a word. I'm a 28-year-old guy, and for most of my adult life, I believed love meant being the one who carried the weight quietly. I grew up thinking that if you cared about someone, you showed it by sacrificing without keeping score. When I met my fiancée, she felt like someone who finally needed me in a way that gave my life purpose. She was warm, emotional, and always talked about how hard things had been for her before we met. I remember thinking, I can be the steady one for us. That idea settled deep in my chest and never really left. We moved fast. Not recklessly, at least not in my mind, just naturally. I stepped into the role of provider almost without discussion. Rent, utilities, groceries, phone bills, little emergencies that always seemed to pop up. I told myself this was what commitment looked like. When I handed over my card or transferred money, she'd smile and say things like, "I hate needing help," or "I promise this won't be forever." Those words felt like reassurance, like a future being built brick by brick. She always framed her dependence as temporary. "Once I'm back on my feet," she'd say, or "just until I figure things out." I believed her every time. I wanted to believe her. There was something intoxicating about being the one she leaned on, the one who made her life feel stable. Even when my account balance shrank, I told myself it was an investment in us. I remember coming home exhausted, dropping my keys on the counter, and hearing her say, "You're amazing, you know that?" Those moments made the stress feel worth it. I felt proud being needed. Proud being reliable. Proud being the guy who never complained. Looking back, I can see how much I tied my self-worth to providing. I convinced myself that loyalty and sacrifice always paid off in the end. That if I just kept giving, love would eventually balance the scales. At the time, I truly believed stability, respect, and partnership were waiting just a little further down the road. I started to notice how quickly that temporary phase stretched into months, then years, without ever really changing. I was still paying for almost everything, and somehow the idea of splitting costs never came up unless I forced it. Whenever I hinted at stress, she'd sigh and say, "You know, I hate feeling like a burden," or "I just need a little more time." The way she said it made me feel guilty for even bringing it up. So I stopped pushing and told myself patience was part of being a good partner. Our days settled into a strange routine. I worked longer hours, picked up extra shifts, and learned how to stretch my paycheck thinner each month. She spent more time at home, scrolling on her phone, talking about plans she wanted to chase someday. I'd come back tired, shoulders tight, and she'd greet me with a quick kiss and a list of things she needed money for. Sometimes she'd laugh and say, "You're basically my hero," and that small praise kept me going longer than it should have. There were moments when I felt uneasy, like when she stopped asking before using my card or when bills quietly became my responsibility by default. If I hesitated, her tone would change. "Why are you acting weird about money?" she'd ask. "You know I do the same for you." I wanted to believe that. I needed to believe that. So I swallowed the discomfort and told myself real love wasn't transactional. Around that time, my best friend started coming around more often. At first it felt normal, he'd always been part of my life. He'd sit on the couch, joke with her, stay for dinner. Sometimes they laughed a little too easily, shared looks I didn't understand. When I noticed, I brushed it off. I didn't want to be the paranoid guy seeing problems everywhere. Still, something subtle shifted. I felt like the provider, not the partner. Like the foundation everyone stood on but no one checked for cracks. And even then, I kept telling myself this was just a phase, that love, loyalty, and patience would eventually bring balance. At first, the red flags were small enough to explain away if I tried hard enough. She started guarding her phone more closely, turning the screen down when I walked into the room. Messages would stop mid-sentence when I entered, followed by a quick, "What?" that sounded a little too sharp. I told myself everyone deserves privacy, even though my stomach tightened every time it happened. I didn't want to be the guy who accused without proof. Her routines shifted too. She'd say she was running errands or clearing her head, but couldn't really explain where she'd been. When I asked simple questions, she'd sigh and say I was overthinking again. You're always stressed lately, she'd tell me, like my worry came from exhaustion instead of instinct. Somehow, the conversation always ended with me apologizing for making things uncomfortable. My best friend started showing up more often during those stretches. He'd drop by unannounced, act overly relaxed, grab drinks from the fridge like he lived there. They had inside jokes I didn't recognize, references I'd clearly missed. Once, I walked in on them laughing on the couch, sitting closer than I expected. The room went quiet for half a second too long. He joked, "Damn, man, you look tired," like that explained everything. I remember standing in the kitchen later, staring at the sink, feeling something heavy press down on my chest. My instincts whispered that something wasn't right, but I pushed the thought away. I told myself I was projecting stress, that real trust meant giving people space. I didn't want to be controlling. I didn't want to ruin what we had over suspicion. At night, lying next to her, I'd replay small moments in my head. The sudden smiles. The secretive texts. The way she'd defend him quickly if I sounded even mildly annoyed. My gut kept tightening, but I forced it quiet. I told myself love meant choosing belief over fear. Still, a crack had formed. Small, almost invisible, but deep enough to let doubt seep in. And once that doubt settled, it didn't leave. It just waited, quietly, for something to finally confirm it. I didn't realize how deep things had gone until money stopped being a shared topic and became an expectation. What started as me helping out slowly turned into me funding everything without discussion. Rent, utilities, groceries, subscriptions, late fees, they all quietly landed on my shoulders. If something unexpected came up, she'd look at me and say, "You've got this, right," like it was already decided. And most of the time, I did. She framed it as teamwork. "We're building a life," she'd say, resting her head on my shoulder. "This is just temporary." I wanted to believe that so badly that I ignored the anxiety tightening in my chest every time I opened my banking app. I stopped buying things for myself. I stopped going out with friends. I told myself sacrifice was part of love, that this phase would pass once she stabilized. What hurt more was how my best friend slowly slid into the same pattern. He'd ask to borrow money just for a bit, always with a story attached. A missed paycheck. A bill he forgot. A rough month. He promised to pay me back, always said, "You know I wouldn't take advantage of you." And I believed him, or maybe I needed to. Saying no felt like betraying both of them. There were moments when I'd overhear them talking quietly in the other room, their voices dropping when I walked by. Sometimes I'd catch my name mentioned, followed by awkward silence. Once, I heard her say, "He won't mind," and my stomach twisted before I could stop it. When I asked what she meant, she laughed it off. "You're imagining things again." I started to feel less like a partner and more like a resource. Like my role was to keep things running while everyone else lived comfortably. Still, I kept paying. Kept providing. Kept telling myself this was what loyalty looked like. But beneath that belief, something ugly was growing, a quiet awareness that I was being used, and that everyone involved seemed perfectly okay with it. The emotional distance crept in so slowly that I didn't notice it at first. Affection became inconsistent, then rare. Conversations felt rushed, like I was interrupting something just by speaking. When I tried to talk about how disconnected I felt, she'd sigh and say, "You're making this bigger than it is," or "You're always so intense lately." Hearing that made me shrink back into myself. I started questioning whether my needs were even reasonable. She criticized more, too, the way I talked, the way I stressed, the way I made everything about money. It was confusing, considering money was the one thing I was constantly giving. Whenever I brought that up, she'd say, "I never asked you to do all that," even though she relied on it every day. The contradiction messed with my head. I'd walk away from arguments feeling guilty, like I'd failed some invisible test. My best friend slowly began taking her side in these moments. If I vented, he'd tell me I was being too sensitive. "She's under pressure too, man," he'd say. "You've gotta be more understanding." Hearing that from him stung more than I wanted to admit. He knew how much I was carrying, yet somehow I was still the problem. I started keeping things to myself just to avoid being told I was wrong for feeling them. The house itself started to feel different. Quieter, heavier. I'd sit on the edge of the couch while they scrolled on their phones, laughing at things I wasn't part of. Sometimes I'd catch them exchanging looks, quick and unreadable. When I asked what was funny, she'd shrug and say, "Nothing, relax." The word relax began to feel like a warning instead of comfort. At night, lying awake beside her, I felt lonelier than I ever had living alone. My chest felt tight, my thoughts looping. I kept telling myself this was just a rough patch, that real relationships went through phases. But deep down, something painful was taking shape, the sense that I was slowly being pushed out of my own place, emotionally replaced while still being financially useful. And I didn't yet realize how close I was to finding out just how replaceable I'd become. It happened on a night that felt completely ordinary, which somehow made it worse. She had fallen asleep early, her phone buzzing softly on the nightstand. I wasn't trying to snoop, I swear I wasn't, but the screen lit up again and again with the same name. My best friend's name. Something in my chest tightened so hard it almost hurt to breathe. I told myself to ignore it, but my hand moved before my courage could stop it. The message preview was short, casual, and devastating. Did he say anything? "I miss you." My ears started ringing as I unlocked the phone, my fingers shaking so badly I nearly dropped it. What I saw next didn't feel real. Long threads of messages, weeks old. Flirting. Jokes. Late-night check-ins. Complaints about me, about how stressed I was, how I didn't get her anymore. Then came the photos. Nothing explicit at first, just intimate enough to erase any doubt. My stomach turned cold as I kept scrolling. There were plans. Secret meetups. Messages about timing things around my work schedule. And then the line that broke something open inside me: "He pays for everything anyway. We just have to be careful." I remember staring at that sentence until my vision blurred. My heart was pounding so hard I thought I might pass out. When I confronted her, she didn't cry at first. She rolled her eyes and said I was invading her privacy. When I asked about him, she hesitated just long enough to tell the truth without meaning to. "It didn't mean anything," she said. "It just happened." The words felt rehearsed, empty. When I asked how long, she snapped, "Why does it matter?" I confronted him next, my voice shaking despite my effort to stay calm. He sighed like I was inconveniencing him and said, "You've been distant, man. Things just happened." Hearing my own pain reduced to an excuse made something inside me go numb. That night, sitting alone in the dark, I realized the truth wasn't just that they betrayed me. It was that they'd been using me together emotionally, financially, and without guilt. And somehow, this was only the beginning. The confrontation didn't bring clarity or closure like I secretly hoped it would. Instead, it twisted everything into something uglier. When I tried to talk to her the next day, calmly this time, she crossed her arms and said, "Why are you acting like you're some victim?" That sentence hit harder than the betrayal itself. I remember standing there, stunned, trying to understand how I had become the problem. She said I was emotionally unavailable, that I worked too much, that I made her feel lonely. Every sentence sounded rehearsed, like she'd practiced them. When I reminded her I worked that much to support us, she shrugged and said, "I never asked you to do all that." Hearing that felt like the floor dropping out from under me. Everything I sacrificed was suddenly rewritten as my own fault. When I confronted my best friend again, hoping for even a shred of remorse, he didn't give me one. He leaned back and said, "Man, you've been checked out for a while. You can't blame us for connecting." The word "us" echoed in my head. He talked like I was some obstacle they had to work around. Like my loyalty had been an inconvenience. What hurt most was how quickly they aligned. Conversations turned into 2 against 1. If I raised my voice, I was unstable. If I stayed quiet, I was manipulative. Every reaction I had became proof that I was the problem. They picked apart my tone, my stress, my exhaustion, until I started doubting my own memory of events. The house felt hostile after that. Silence wasn't peaceful anymore, it was loaded. They whispered in the other room. They exchanged looks when I spoke. I could feel myself shrinking, second-guessing every word before it left my mouth. I started apologizing just to stop the tension, even when I didn't know what I was apologizing for. That's when it hit me, they weren't trying to fix anything. They were trying to wear me down. And somehow, in their version of the story, I wasn't the betrayed one, I was the obstacle standing in the way of what they wanted. By the time I hit my breaking point, the betrayal wasn't even shocking anymore, it was routine. They stopped hiding things altogether. She'd stay out late without explanations, come home detached, barely looking at me. He'd show up whenever he wanted, comfortable, casual, like the place belonged to him just as much as it did to me. And somehow, I was still paying for everything while being treated like an inconvenience in my own home. What crushed me wasn't just the cheating. It was the realization that they expected me to keep funding their lives. Bills still landed on my desk. Subscriptions still renewed. Groceries still disappeared. When I hesitated, she'd snap, "So now you're punishing me?" The guilt hit instantly, sharp and familiar. I give in just to stop the tension, hating myself the entire time. I remember one night sitting alone in my car after work, engine off, hands shaking on the steering wheel. I couldn't bring myself to go inside. The idea of walking into that house, into their whispers and looks, made my chest feel tight. I stared at the dashboard and thought, how did I end up here? I had given everything I had, and somehow I was the one begging for scraps of respect. Inside, I felt hollow. I stopped eating regularly. Sleep came in short, restless bursts. My thoughts looped endlessly, what I should have said, what I missed, how stupid I must have looked. I replayed every sacrifice like evidence against myself. The shame was heavy, crushing, and isolating. The worst part was realizing they weren't afraid of losing me. They were only afraid of losing access to my money. That truth hit hard one night when I overheard her say, "He'll calm down. He always does." She said it casually, like a fact. Like I was predictable. Manageable. That was my lowest point. Sitting alone in the dark, realizing I'd been reduced to a resource instead of a person. I felt small, disposable, and deeply ashamed for allowing it. But somewhere beneath the exhaustion and humiliation, something quiet started to shift. A numbness settled in, not despair, but clarity. And without saying a word to either of them, I started thinking about what it would mean to stop surviving and start disappearing from their control. The change didn't come with anger or speeches. It came quietly, almost like something inside me finally went still. I stopped trying to explain myself. I stopped arguing, stopped defending, stopped asking for honesty. Outwardly, I looked the same, tired, compliant, predictable. Inside, though, I was watching everything with a new kind of distance. I started paying attention in a way I never had before. I noticed how casually they talked about money when they thought I wasn't listening. How plans were made with the assumption I'd cover them. How my name came up only when something was needed. I stopped reacting to the disrespect, and that seemed to confuse them. My silence wasn't submission anymore, it was calculation. I began quietly separating my life from theirs. Small things at first. I changed passwords. I opened a new account they didn't know about. I rerouted my paycheck. I reviewed statements late at night, scrolling slowly, documenting every charge and transfer. Each discovery hurt, but it also strengthened my resolve. I wasn't spiraling anymore. I was preparing. They mistook my calm for surrender. She even softened her tone for a while, acting sweet again, slipping into the version of herself that used to work on me. "You've been different," she said once, touching my arm. "Better." I nodded, played along, and said nothing. Inside, I felt strangely detached, like I was watching a scene I'd already emotionally left. My best friend grew bolder too. He joked about future plans in front of me, like I was invisible. Sometimes he'd smirk when she laughed at something he said. It hurt, but not the way it used to. The pain had sharpened into focus. I was no longer confused about what was happening or who they were. At night, instead of spiraling, I made quiet lists in my head. What I needed. What I could walk away from. What I had to protect. I imagined a version of myself not constantly apologizing, not bracing for betrayal. That image became my anchor. They thought I was still trapped. Still predictable. Still theirs to manage. What they didn't realize was that I had already emotionally stepped out of the room, and once I did, every move I made after that was deliberate. Once I made the decision to leave quietly, everything shifted into focus. I stopped reacting emotionally and started thinking practically. Late at night, after they'd gone to sleep, I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop and went through every account, every bill, every shared expense. I realized how deeply intertwined my money had become with their comfort. Untangling it felt overwhelming, but also strangely empowering. I started with small, invisible moves. I changed passwords first: email, banking, subscriptions. I opened a separate account and redirected my paycheck there, telling myself I'd fix things later if anyone noticed. I canceled automatic payments one by one, spacing them out so it wouldn't raise alarms. Each click felt like reclaiming a piece of myself. My hands shook, but my mind felt clearer than it had in months. They didn't notice at first. She was still spending like nothing had changed, still talking about future plans as if I were just a background character funding the story. My best friend joked one night about a trip they wanted to take, glancing at me like it was obvious I'd help cover it. I nodded, non-committal, keeping my face neutral. Inside, I felt almost calm. Detached. Like I was watching a lie continue on borrowed time. I started moving my personal things quietly. Clothes I didn't wear often. Important documents. Items with emotional value. I put them in my car before work or stashed them somewhere safe. Each removed object made the apartment feel less like a trap and more like a place I was already leaving behind. What surprised me most was how peaceful I felt during all of this. There was no rage, no dramatic urge to confront them. Just focus. Precision. I wasn't planning revenge, I was planning freedom. Still, I knew what would happen once the money stopped. I knew the panic, the accusations, the sudden affection would come. They were building their future on the assumption that I'd always be there to catch them. They had no idea the net was already gone. And when it finally disappeared, everything they'd been pretending not to see was about to come crashing down. The day I left didn't feel dramatic. It felt quiet, almost unreal. They were both out. She said she was running errands, and he had texted that he'd stop by later. I took that window and used it. I packed the last of my clothes, my laptop, documents, and the few things that still felt like mine. Every sound in the apartment felt loud, like the walls were watching me leave. I didn't leave a note. I didn't send a message. I didn't owe explanations anymore. I took one last look around the place I had paid for, supported, and slowly disappeared inside of. There was no sadness left, just a strange calm. When I closed the door behind me, it felt like exhaling after holding my breath for years. The silence didn't last long. Within hours, my phone started lighting up. Missed calls. Texts. At first confused, "Where are you?" Then annoyed, "This isn't funny." Then panicked. The tone shifted fast once payments started bouncing and cards stopped working. I watched the notifications stack up without opening them, my chest tight but steady. Her messages turned sharp. "You can't just disappear like this." Then softer. "Please, we need to talk." Then angry again. My best friend followed with his own wave of texts, pretending to be concerned while slipping in guilt. "You're overreacting. We can fix this. Don't be childish." Reading them felt surreal, like watching actors panic after the stage lights went out. I didn't respond to any of it. For the first time, I wasn't explaining myself. I wasn't defending my feelings or trying to be understood. I was just gone. And that silence said more than any argument ever could. That night, alone in a quiet room that actually felt safe, I sat on the edge of the bed and felt something unfamiliar settle in my chest. Not happiness. Not relief. Something steadier. Control. They were scrambling now, forced to face the reality they'd avoided. and for the first time, their chaos wasn't mine to clean up. Still, I knew this wasn't the end. What came next would show me exactly who they really were once the safety net was gone. The fallout came faster than I expected. Within days, mutual friends started reaching out, confused by half-told stories and shifting versions of the truth. Apparently, I'd abandoned her. I'd overreacted. I'd lost it. What they didn't say, what they couldn't explain, was why the money had suddenly stopped, or why both of them were suddenly scrambling. The cracks in their story showed almost immediately. People started noticing inconsistencies. Bills unpaid. Plans cancelled. Excuses piling up. The confident version of them I'd lived under for so long began to unravel. I heard through someone else that they were fighting constantly now, blaming each other for miscalculations. It was strange hearing that word used about my life, like I'd been a spreadsheet instead of a person. Still, I stayed quiet. Silence had become my boundary. For the first time in years, I focused on myself without guilt attached. I slept through the night. I ate real meals. I felt my body unclench slowly, like it was learning safety again. There were moments the anger came back, sharp, hot, demanding justice, but it passed. I didn't need to confront them to feel validated anymore. Watching their illusion collapse on its own was enough. One evening, I got a long message from her. Not angry this time. Desperate. She said she missed what we had, that things had gotten complicated, that maybe we could talk like adults. I read it once, then closed the app. I didn't block her out of spite. I just didn't need access anymore. What surprised me most was the peace. The quiet wasn't lonely, it was spacious. I started rebuilding slowly, carefully, on my own terms. I learned that love doesn't demand you disappear. Loyalty doesn't mean self-erasure. And sacrifice means nothing if it's one-sided. Looking back, I don't feel proud for enduring the betrayal. I feel proud for walking away from it. I didn't scream. I didn't expose them. I didn't fight for closure that was never coming. I simply stepped out of a story where I was being used and let the people who wrote that story face its ending without me.